Hey everyone! This is the Read Aloud for Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors. Today we're going to be doing chapters 7 and 8. I'll post links to the earlier videos in the description below. So now let's jump in to chapter 7. Alexander gets kidnapped by a princess. How's the swamp? Ida smirked. It was spring. The air was finally warming, and the forest was ablaze with colorful wildflowers. Despite this, Alexander locked himself in his house and plugged every opening with old rags. If Ida hadn't materialized in the middle of the room, she never would have gotten in. The swamp was infested with bees. It's, very pretty, he answered, forcing a smile. He picked up a piece of bark and scraped a stinger out of his arm. Lots of flowers and, lots of bees. Found any gold yet? She asked, her smirk broadening. He shook his head. She looked at the swelling sting on his arm. It seems to me it found you. Then she glanced around the room. You really should get some more candles, Your Majesty. It's dark in here. I wish you wouldn't speak in riddles, Alexander commented. Ida looked offended. Why do you always assume I am speaking in riddles? Can I get you something? Alexander sighed. He didn't know whether or not fairies needed to eat like humans, but thought it polite to offer. I don't have much left. I have some bread. It's a bit stale, though. Ida took a seat on an old crate. Alexander didn't have any chairs. Stale bread isn't so bad if you put a little honey on it. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Why would she think he had honey? Peasants didn't have honey. It was rare and expensive. His mouth fell open. Why, Alexander, Ida said, you look as if you've just solved a riddle. It's about time. That was excruciating. Alexander had no idea how to extract the honey from the beehives, but Ida promised she would send someone to help him. The next day, a band of lost friars knocked on the door. They'd come to ask for directions, but when they saw the beehives, they started jumping up and down and singing Te Deum. He had a bit of trouble communicating with them, as he couldn't speak Celtic, and, while they did know Latin, they had very thick accents. Eventually, they managed by passing notes. All educated cults use Latin for writing, since their native language consisted only of 5 runes, and was therefore useless for practical conversation. The friars were destined for the nearby monastery of St. Ludin, and when they arrived there, they told their fellows about the wonderful discovery in Alexander's swamp. The abbot immediately sent 2 of his own, Brother Joseph the Elder and Brother Joseph the Younger, to assist with the bees. Alexander couldn't help but smile when they introduced themselves, wondering if he would ever befriend a monk whose name wasn't Joseph. All through the summer, the Josephs came and went, first showing Alexander how to extract the honey, and then showing him how to make candles and soaps out of beeswax. They also helped him improve his Celtic. He had a gift for learning languages, and was fluent in no time at all. Alexander would periodically load a cart with the goods they produced, and take them into the city to sell. The local merchants noticed that he was fair and straightforward, and the friars loved him for his diligence. He was a new and exciting face. The townsfolk spoke of him frequently, commenting on his knowledge, generosity, and manners. As Alika promised, his reputation flourished. He became known in the city as Alexander the Greek. He tried to correct this at first, but soon realized that most of the townsfolk were uneducated. He doubted any of them could find Calathea on a map. It didn't help that Greek was his first language. Supposedly, Calatheans had a language of their own in ages past, but no one could remember it. In the ancient world, stealing culture from the Greeks was something of a fad, and the Calatheans did not want to be left out. Of course, after over a millennium of linguistic evolution, Calathean Greek was a bit different. When the bees returned the second year, Alexander was prepared for them. His skills improved, he sold more, and he gained more confidence. When he needed help, he went to visit the friars. He made a decent living for himself, and decided to use some of his earnings to take up painting again. When he was a prince, this was his favorite pastime. He spent the winter mixing colors by candlelight. His art was mostly the faces of the saints, but now and then he diverged, immortalizing the faces of other people. He started to paint his parents, but had to imagine how his mother looked since she died when he was a baby. When he realized she probably looked like Fausta, he left the painting unfinished. The third year came and went, and Alexander realized that he was comfortable and content. He never imagined becoming a candle maker, but it was certainly better than being a king. Still, he had a hole in his heart. He was respected by everyone, but did not have any close friends. Not a soul knew who he really was, and keeping that secret made him feel isolated. On a cold afternoon during the fourth autumn, he pushed his cart along the road to the city. It was to be his last load that year. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and he prayed it wouldn't snow until he returned home. He suddenly heard hooves thundering behind him. "Stop!" a woman called. Alexander dropped the cart and swung around in alarm. Two riders halted before him. The first, a lady of royal blood, adorned in colorful raiment and jewelry. A crown circled her head atop a white veil. The second was a mountain of a warrior, likely the woman's guard. Alexander bowed respectfully. "Are you Alexander the Greek?" she demanded. "I am," he answered. "Excellent. Egbert, grab him," she demanded. "Sorry, what?" But before Alexander could finish speaking, the warrior rode up behind him, grabbed him by the shoulder, lifted him onto his horse, and sent the animal charging forward. "Who are you? What is the meaning of this?" Alexander demanded. "I am Princess Ilona," she cried, galloping after him, "sister of King Florian of North Caltahaven and King Filbert of the South. I require your services." "I am a free citizen," Alexander protested, "and I demand you stop immediately and explain yourself." "Citizen?" Ilona laughed. "How like a Greek." "I am a Calathian," Alexander retorted indignantly. "Same thing," she returned. "No, not remotely," Alexander snapped. "I thought a lady of your status would know that. I forget you're still a barbarian." She slowed her horse a bit so she was riding parallel to Egbert and looked at Alexander with a devilish grin. "That's exactly what a Greek would say." Alexander's mouth dropped open for a moment, and then his face went scarlet. "How dare you?" he started, but she charged on ahead. "You kidnap me, you insult me, you can't—" He continued calling after her, but she did not respond. He finally ceased calling and started brooding silently. Getting kidnapped by a princess was the pinnacle of humiliation. At last they came to an open plain. Alexander could see a battle encampment in the distance. He prayed that wasn't their destination. God heard his prayer, but ignored it. Ilona rode straight into the midst of the soldiers and dismounted. Egbert halted just behind him and dropped Alexander on the ground. He leaped to his feet, hoping to retain whatever dignity he had left. A knight with a massive blue plume in his helmet greeted Ilona with a low bow. "Princess," he said, "you shouldn't be here." "I need to speak with my brother. It's urgent," she replied. "Of course," the knight answered. "I'll tell him you're here." "Well?" Alexander demanded. His arms were crossed and he was scowling at the princess. "Are you going to explain yourself?" "My stupid brothers are fighting again. I brought you here so you could talk some sense into them." Alexander stared at her blankly. She sighed. "Last month, Filbert came to stay at Castle Erskgrim so we could all celebrate the harvest festival together. There we were, enjoying the feast like a peaceful, respectable family, when Filbert mentions that he's been reading the philosopher Severinius and agrees with his theory that the entire universe is made up of triangles. Then Florian answered that he's been reading Caius and that the universe is actually made up of nautilus spirals." Alexander rolled his eyes. "That's a massive oversimplification. Reuven later clarified that the movable elements are made up of nautilus spirals and the immovable elements are made up of triangles." "That's exactly what I tried to tell them!" Ilona exclaimed. "Wait, you've read Reuven?" Alexander asked, his scowl shrinking slightly. "Of course I've read Reuven," she snapped. "I'm not completely ignorant, you know." "So why wouldn't they listen to you?" "Because women are incapable of reason," she replied. "So they've read some Reuven too," Alexander mumbled thoughtfully. "But why me? Couldn't you send any other man in to talk to them?" "I've heard that you are knowledgeable on such matters. The friars speak very highly of you, you know," she said. "If I talk to your brothers, will you let me go home?" "Of course I will." "All right," Alexander grumbled. I'll talk to them, but I can't promise it will change anything. And I expect full repayment for anything in my cart I find damaged or missing on my return." She laughed. "My brothers may be idiots, but they are very dear to me. If you save them, I will give you anything your heart desires." Having pointless philosophical arguments was how aristocrats entertained themselves in the Middle Ages. And like many who entertain themselves in this way, the kings knew a little about philosophy, but thought they knew a lot. Ilona finally convinced the two of them to sit down with Alexander in Florian's camp. Alexander had to look back and forth between them a number of times to make sure his vision was correct. They were identical twins. He was grateful Florian had a beard, or he would have lost track of which was which. He stayed with them long into the night, gently asking them questions and directing their thoughts. Each time one brother became enraged, it took only a few patient words from Alexander to calm him. When the dawn came, the brothers left the tent laughing together. "You have enlightened me, Alexander," Florian exclaimed, giving him a slap on the back that sent him stumbling forward. "The movable elements! It makes so much sense." Ilona rolled her eyes and muttered several unladylike words under her breath. "To think we almost killed each other," Filbert admitted. Florian slapped his hand on Filbert's shoulder. "I've been trying to kill you since before I was born." They both dissolved into laughter. Ilona was not amused. "No more philosophy," she insisted. "I don't like what it does to you two." Alexander bowed deeply to the kings. "If there is nothing more I can do for your majesties, I really must be getting back to my cart." "You can't leave now," Florian exclaimed. "You must come back to the Castle Erskrim. My brother and I are going to throw a feast to celebrate the restoration of our friendship." "Oh no," Ilona breathed. She grabbed Alexander's arm. "My brother is right. You will be our guest of honor. We will seat you right between our two kings." He jerked away from her. She had no boundaries, and it irritated him. "I can't," Alexander began, sending an anxious glance toward the cloudy sky. She slipped a coin purse into Alexander's hand and hissed, "Don't worry about the cart. The security of the kingdom is at stake." The feast triggered memories of the Calathian palace. So many faces all talking at once, so many unwritten social rules to remember. Alexander didn't like feasts. Well, he liked the food, just not the atmosphere. He was surrounded by people, and yet felt completely alone. The feast at Erskrim was worse than any of the ones in Calathea, because he only knew the hosts, and them only a little. He was also horrified to discover that the rumors about the cults letting dogs into their dining halls were true. The hounds patrolled the tables, snapping up scraps that fell onto the floor. The cult seemed to find their begging endearing and would reward them generously. Alexander found the whole thing unsanitary. He jumped when he felt something touching him from under the table, and looked down to see one of the creatures resting its head on his knee. It was a large black dog with a short coat, floppy ears, and giant, brown, sorrowful eyes. Eyes that looked like they had witnessed 1,000 tragedies. They were actually very much like Alexander's. "Hello, dog," he greeted, bringing a hesitant hand toward its nose. This had to be a deception. He was sure he was going to lose a finger, but he couldn't help reaching out toward the velvety snout. "Hey, Lonzo," Ilona shouted, giving the dog's face a swat. "Leave him alone. Away with you." The animal disappeared under the tablecloth. "Don't let Lonzo fool you," Ilona warned. "He's as deceptive as he is greedy, and he's had plenty tonight." Alexander looked across the room. Lonzo was lying in the corner with his head on his forepaws, looking at him with those gentle, soul-swallowing eyes. Alexander looked away in an attempt to ease the guilt in his heart. He tried to focus on the conversations taking place around him. Filbert and Florian loved quoting the philosophers and did so liberally. Their actual understanding of philosophy was superficial. When they spoke, he felt embarrassed for them. Then there was Ilona. She wasn't able to add much to their discussion because they kept talking over her and interrupting. This irritated Alexander because he was sincerely interested in her opinion. He wasn't sure who she had read or how much, but she seemed to have an understanding that her brothers lacked. When the feast was drawing to a close, she stepped away. Alexander followed her, eager for an excuse to get out. He found her looking out onto the bailey at the heavy snowfall. Her face was white with horror. "Is everything all right?" Alexander asked. "Look at that snow," she said. "It's been falling heavier and heavier. Do you know what this means?" Alexander shook his head. "It means Filbert can't leave tomorrow. And if this winter is anything like the last, it's only going to keep snowing, and we won't be rid of him until spring." She looked at Alexander with an exasperated expression. "If I have to be stuck here with those two all winter, I am going to fling myself off the North Tower." "It can't be that bad," Alexander answered, although he had enough experience with siblings to know that it could be. In fact, it could be a lot worse. "My only consolation is that you're stuck here too. If you can't keep those two civil, no one can." Alexander's heart sank. His little house wasn't much, but it was his own private space. His paints were there too. He hoped Ilona was wrong about the snow. Otherwise he'd be imprisoned with strangers for months. He told himself that at least it wouldn't be so damp, and the food would certainly be better, and Ilona made interesting conversation. Then something wonderful occurred to him. "Princess," he asked, "do you have any books here?" Books were not something he could afford on a candlemaker's salary. He had to go to the friary when he wanted to read. "Of course we do," she answered. "Follow me, I'll show you the library." Alexander's heart skipped. He could tolerate almost anything for the sake of books. Chapter 8. Modern Architecture. The library was a tiny, windowless room containing one chair, a shallow desk, and about 30 books. 20 of them the princess owned personally, and the others were loaned from the friary. Ilona explained that she exchanged them with the friars when she wanted something new. Alexander felt a twinge of jealousy. The friars never let him take books home. He had to sit in their library until he finished reading. He could tell which ones belonged to the friars because they had a little hole in the binding where they had been chained to the shelves. This was to keep visitors from succumbing to temptation and making off with them. Alexander supposed getting to borrow books was one of the privileges of being royalty. To Alexander, that little room was paradise. He forgot that he was angry with Ilona for kidnapping him, and sat with her late into the evening, talking and poring over different texts. As the night wore on, their conversations became less and less intelligent, and everything became amusing, and they found themselves laughing together at absolutely nothing. The days came and went, one after another, and Alexander was the happiest he'd ever been. He wasn't sure why. He had books back at Calathea. A lot more books, better books. What he didn't have was a close friend. Ilona was intelligent and adventurous. She had a bold, slightly irreverent sense of humor. He spent every possible moment in her company. She often spoke of her brothers, which made Alexander aware of two things. First, that she adored them, and second, that she was always on the verge of strangling them. "I've never seen them agree about anything except that I should be locked away in a cloister," she complained one day. "I escaped 3 times before the Mother Superior refused to take me back." Alexander was sitting on the floor of the library, with his back to the wall and an ecclesiastical history open on his lap. Lonzo was lying on the floor at his feet, resting his sorrowful head on Alexander's ankles. The creature had taken a liking to him and made a habit of following him wherever he went. He glanced up at Ilona. She was occupying the only chair in the room. It seemed to him that her deep understanding of the scriptures and philosophy made her an ideal candidate for the convent. "But why?" he asked. "You'd have made such an excellent nun." "What's that supposed to mean?" she questioned. Alexander blushed. He paused, trying to figure out why his previous statement warranted such a reaction. He stuttered, trying to buy himself some time while he contemplated the error of his words. "I mean that you're so pious." "So piety is reserved for the consecrated in the Greek church," she grinned. "And you say we're unorthodox." "No, but, Alexander struggled desperately to grasp the words that would save him. You're such a deep thinker. Doesn't a life of contemplation appeal to you?" "Certainly, but the cloister isn't my calling," she replied. "Oh," Alexander answered, mulling over her words. "As he understood it, your parents decided what your calling was. Long before he was born, his father and mother decided they were going to give their 3rd child to the church. Alexander never questioned their decision, but was ready to obey like a good son. In truth, he liked that the decision was made for him. He had plenty to worry about without having to decide what he wanted to do with his life. How do you know it isn't your calling? He asked. Because insanity is not becoming for a nun, and the longer I am cooped up, the more my sanity wanes. Just wait a few more weeks, you'll see. Alexander's mind raced. The idea of choosing his own path in life was terrifying, more terrifying than being ordered to take the crown. He admired Ilona's courage. He wondered how she would make a decision like that. What will you do now? Alexander pressed. Now that's a bold question, Ilona accused. Alexander sighed. He was amazed that she hadn't asked him to leave with the way he kept offending her. Despite her criticism, her expression was amused, not angry. It was almost like she enjoyed making him feel uncomfortable. I apologize, he said, and looked back at his book. But if you insist on knowing, I am building a cathedral, Ilona explained. You're what? Alexander asked. Well, having one built, Ilona clarified. I want to dedicate my life to doing something that will help the people, glorify God, and make every other kingdom feel inferior. She leapt up from her seat and withdrew a rolled piece of parchment from a chest next to the bookshelf. She beckoned for Alexander to come and look as she spread it on the table. It was a drawing of a magnificent structure. The bell towers were at least as high as Erskrim's, assuming the drawing was to scale. What drew Alexander's attention immediately was the size of the windows. They seemed to take up a large portion of the outer wall, and he wondered how the building could stand with such a vulnerability. Did you draw this? Alexander asked. Ilona laughed. No, I've hired an architect from France. I heard wonderful things about him. Of course, none of his churches will be completed in our lifetimes, but I suppose my grandchildren will assess his talents properly. By the way, she interjected, you are going to paint the altarpiece. Alexander looked perplexed. How did she know about his painting? You painted St. John, didn't you? The one in the vestibule at St. Luden's? She asked. Oh yes, Alexander replied. That was mine. You're wonderful, Ilona stated, and that's why I've chosen you. Alexander tried not to let the exhilaration he was feeling show. He pressed his lips together to keep himself from slipping into a smile. I doubt you'll be ready for an altarpiece in my lifetime. Ilona waved off his objection. Just do it before you die. Your grandchildren can install it. She stretched. It was late in the evening. Alexander hoped she wasn't thinking about going to bed. He was enjoying their conversation, despite the fact that he kept embarrassing himself. He was relieved when she continued speaking. Tell me, why are you a candle maker when you can paint so well? That's a long story, Alexander answered. The night is young, Ilona pushed. Well, my father was a governor back in Calathea, Alexander began, crafting his words carefully. And when I was born, he decided he would give me to the church. Youngest child? Ilona asked. He nodded. Why do parents always give the church their spare children? She ranted. Isn't that like throwing God the leftovers? Leftovers? Alexander objected indignantly. Your Highness, we youngest children are the best our parents have to offer. We are the perfection of their art. Ilona giggled. You've a brilliant mind. In any case, Alexander continued, I thought I should learn something that would be suited to the monastic life. So I learned to write icons, copy manuscripts, translate, that sort of thing. Then my elder brother died unexpectedly, and I became my father's heir. I'm sorry, Ilona answered. Did your brother die fighting? Alexander thought. No, I don't think he ever saw it coming. Don't you have any family left? She pressed. No, he answered. My father died a few years ago, and my mother died before I was born. Ilona snorted in an attempt to conceal a laugh. It didn't work. The laugh burst forth, and she turned bright red as she tried to stop herself. I'm so sorry, Alex, she cried. It's not your parents' deaths. Alexander realized what he'd said and smiled sheepishly. After I was born, he corrected. I know that's what you meant, she answered. I shouldn't have laughed, but you said it so seriously. It's all right, Alexander smirked. We both know you're a heartless person. You're never going to let me forget this, are you? She said. He shook his head, his smile broadening triumphantly. This made her laugh all the more. Once she'd recovered herself, the conversation moved to other things. Alexander felt a twinge of guilt leaving Fausta out of his story. These days, he avoided thinking about her, as if ignoring her existence would erase her betrayal. Alright, that's the end of Chapter 8. So tune in next time for Chapters 9 and 10. See you later!